And tonight's tale. Rules are a dime a dozen. The Covenant. Pt.4. I ran my hand gently up and down Briar's back as he clung to my waist and shook with terrified sobs and tried to be comforting. Hey, buddy. What's all this you're talking about? You had a bad dream? All thoughts of the weirdness on the stairwell were forgotten as I tried to comfort my child after his nightmare. It was likely a mixture of the smooth, rounded walls of the lighthouse and my foggy, half-asleep brain, making the sound of his cries echo up towards my bedroom that woke me up in the first place. Briar was the more sensitive child, and was prone to nightmares when he was younger. He hadn't had one in years. But Ashley and I were always on the lookout for things that might cause another one. And the story Devlin had told when we were having dinner was certain to set him over the edge. We had hoped that Devlin cleverly adding in that bit about the rules would have kept the poor kid from being afraid, but apparently not. Briar explained that when Ashley and I were at the emergency room to get stitches put in after I split my head open, like an idiot, the delivery guys came out with our groceries. Because Ashley had told them not to leave the house while we were gone, they had let the people bring everything up the driveway and to the front door. One of the rules that we had been given was to make sure that no delivery personnel were allowed to come onto the property. Now, because of Devlin's story, the child was absolutely convinced that there were ghosts in the lighthouse that were going to exact their unearthly revenge upon all of us. I calmed him down, explaining to the kid that ghosts weren't real. It's just an old story that Devlin was telling, trying to be a good guest and to get to know you kids and be entertaining. None of it was true, and no one was going to come and snatch him out of his bed in the middle of the night. Then I told him that those rules weren't about keeping ghosts in check, but that they were in order to protect my employer, Mrs. Geraldine, from a lawsuit if a delivery person or visitor got hurt on the property. Even slipping on ice in the winter or tripping on a star could result in the poor woman paying millions if we had someone who wasn't insured on the property. After a while, Briar was able to calm down as it started to sink in that his fears were unfounded, and whatever he had been dreaming about was just that, a dream. He laid down at last, and I got him tucked into the blankets. I sat with him while he went back to sleep, and then carefully stood up from the side of his bed and slipped out of the door back into the hole. Poor kid. He really was the sensitive one, as Ashley always said. I looked down at my wrist to check the time on my watch and sighed. It was just about 5 AM now. Time out for going back to sleep. Instead of heading back to bed, I made my way down the stairs to the ground floor kitchen and started to make some coffee, smiling a little at all the little white labels and their black ink that my darling wife had affixed to everything in order to keep it organised. As the coffee was brewing in the machine, I dug out a pan and a spatula and laid them down on the counter before grabbing a bowl and a whisk. I might as well make some breakfast and hopefully surprise Ashley. Outside, the windows that ringed the kitchen, the thin lights of the Stalward chased each other round and round in a never-ending loop, illuminating the grounds and the sea, even as the sun was struggling its way up over the horizon. I lined a baking sheet with tinfoil before placing down several strips of bacon, evenly spiced, and tossing the pan into the oven to bake. A little trick that I had picked up from Ashley. It truly was so much easier than trying to fry bacon for everyone on the stovetop. After pouring myself a cup of coffee, I started cracking eggs into a large mixing bowl and toasting some English muffins once I had dumped the eggs into the pan, alternating between dropping baked goods into the toaster and stirring the eggs around with a spatula. Ashley normally did the cooking, but I could handle breakfast, at least. It took me several tries, opening and closing cabinet doors, until I found where she had hid the plates. In the cabinet, just to the left of the sink, as it turned out. And I laid out 4 on the kitchen island, dropping toasted English muffins onto each as they popped up, and spread a little butter and jam onto each one. I was just pulling the bacon out of the oven when Ashley made her way downstairs, surprised to find me in the kitchen. She smiled as she saw what I was up to, and made her way over to the coffee pot, pouring herself a cup into her favourite mug. I had gotten it for her years ago on our honeymoon. It was chipped on the handle now, but she still used it religiously, even as the little red design of the interlocking heart had faded away in places, leaving just the off-white colour of the mug, as it appeared to have random flecks of red paint stained on the front. Ashley gave me a kiss on the cheek and thanked me for handling breakfast, then made her way up the stairs to rouse the kids while I plated up the eggs and poured out glasses of orange juice. I moved everything to the table and was rummaging around through drawers for forks when Ashley and the kids slid in onto the benches by the table. Breakfast with the family was lovely and mostly quiet while everyone was eating and waking up. So I took the opportunity to tell Ashley that I was going to head into town today to pick up some supplies for the yard. We'd be needing some shovels and soil at the very least, perhaps a packer or 2, some grass seed, a spreader, that sort of thing. I'd also see if maybe there was a store in town that sold bedding while I was there, and asked if there was anything else she wanted for me to pick up while I was out. Nothing came to mind for her, and she planned to spend much of the day doing some baking. I'd keep the kids out of her hair, I said, saying that could both help me outside with the yard. There were the typical groans of displeasure from each of them at the prospect of doing yard work all day. But then I dangled the idea of the puppy, who would need a good yard to play around in, and they immediately got on board with the idea, just as I had suspected. After breakfast, Ashley took care of the dishes, while I headed upstairs to take a quick shower and get dressed to head into town, while the kids went off to do their schooling. I have to say, for being so far set out from everything, we had surprisingly good water pressure. The shower was warm and steamy and did wonders for loosening my tight muscles and washing away the drowsiness that I had been feeling. When I dried off, I got dressed in some jeans and a plain blue shirt, socks and shoes, and then made my way up to the lantern room to turn off the light. It was well enough after sunrise now, and I threw the switch and listened to the gentle thrumming of the mechanisms as the pulls slowed and eventually came to a stop, before I made my way all the way back down the ground floor. 8 flights of stairs is not fun, no matter which direction you're going. Ashley must have snuck upstairs and dressed while I was in the shower. Now there she was in the kitchen, apron on, and some upbeat instrumental playlist blasting out of her phone as she bopped around, grabbing ingredients for whatever baked glory she was about to bring into existence. I pecked her on the cheek, double-checked that she didn't need anything while I was out, and grabbed the keys and headed to the truck. The engine purred to life, and I started backing down the driveway before getting out, opening the gate, and backing out onto the road. I decided to leave the gate unlocked, but tugged it closed, and began to drive into town down the winding road. I got to really take it all in this time. The last 2 times I had been this way had either been after a cross-country drive of days-long stretches of highway, or else with a concussion and the slight delirium that comes along with a head wound. It really was lovely country out this way. Forest stretched for what I could only assume was miles in every direction, bisected by the little black road with its double yellow lines painted right down the middle as it twisted and turned its way, ever downward from the elevated coast towards the town that lay in the valley beyond. The trees were densely packed and just beginning to turn for the fall, green leaves starting to hint at the brilliance of the yellows and oranges and reds that would soon be popping up all over, interspersed with the evergreen pines whose boughs stretched out wide in the gloom from the overarching canopies, even as the sunlight filtered down through. I rolled down my window and was greeted by the scent of what I can only describe as untouched nature, a mixture of pine and damp and fresh, with just a touch of the sea from behind me. I didn't bother to turn on the radio, content to the sound of the wind whistling through my open window and the scenery all around, the gentle hum of my tyres and the slight vibration in the cab from the engine of the truck. It was shaping up to be a nice little life, I reflected. I was making good money now for easy work. We had more space than we had ever had. It was all working out perfectly. That little ember of masculine pride flared to life in my chest again as I drove. What more could a man like me ask for than to be able to come home to a happy wife and a house that was going to smell of baked goods, to labour in the yard for a while? Ashley's thing had always been the inside of the house, decorating and cleaning and cooking and making everything cosy just the way she wanted it. Now I finally had the ability to do the same outside, and I had plans forming for the grounds. Mrs. Geraldine had had no issue with the idea of my making additions to the property when we had discussed it before we moved, so long as everything was well kept and nothing fell into disrepair. It would take some doing to get the ground flattened out and to prompt the grass to sprout back where it was disturbed, I had no doubt. But after that, the world was my oyster. We could already see Ashley and I sitting around outside at night near a fire pit, maybe sharing a bottle of wine or a couple of bottles of beer, as the leaves of the coming autumn drifted along on the wind, watching the kids toast some marshmallows or chase fireflies through the yard. We'd built such a fire pit in a buddy's backyard years ago, and it wasn't all that difficult of an endeavour. Maybe we'd even get a little grill station set up for next spring. I could build it all up this fall, and then order in a nice stainless steel piece, since I wasn't going to be using it over the winter anyways. Inlay a stone path from the front door over to it. Yeah. It would definitely take plenty of time to work on projects, but I had all the time I needed now since my work didn't require hours and hours of my time every day anymore. As I made my way into the town at last, I was struck by just how quaint the place truly was. Now, stepping back into the past, at least 20 years, back when main streets were lined with little shops owned and operated by the locals, rather than big box stores. In the centre of town, dividing the main street so that it could split off into 4 different directions, was a little square that held a white gazebo and a large clock on a brass pole with the name of the town on it. The bricks that made a little platform under the gazebo were all engraved with names and dates, presumably of the townsfolk, and a small banner hung on the side of the gazebo, informing me that the town square was made possible by donations to the local Rotary Club. To the north side of the square, from which direction I had come, sat a church, its grey stones stretching towards the heavens, with 2 large wooden doors out front, which were polished to a gleaming mahogany hue. The wooden sign, with its inlaid gold lettering, declared it to be St. Thomas Roman Catholic Church, which held Mass on Sunday at 8 a.m, 10:30 a.m, and 3 p.m, and hosted seniors bingo on Saturday nights, starting at 5. We turned left to follow the road around the square to the east, and could see a small memorial park with a stone statue on a plinth of some important figure riding a horse, planked on the ground by a couple of old cannons, the grass stretching out beyond to hold a few trees and a garden of carefully maintained flowers. While the road continued on in that direction for some ways, before crossing over a small bridge that rose up over some railroad tracks, and a sign led to a sort of off-ramp style decline, with a sign that read Railroad Museum. Rather than following the road that way, I swung around the town square, following the curve of the road, roundabout style, to continue south towards what looked like the commercial district of the town. Each side of the road held a number of little shops, with their grey coin-based parking meters out front. On the left, we passed a diner with its large windows that wrapped around the corner, and its little booths, bustling with a few of the locals as a waitress hurried from table to table, laughing and smiling and carrying food. A small salon that had a wall of nail polish in different colours. Whilst on the right, past a place called Fuller's Five and Dime, the Mona Lisa Italian Ristorante, and then a long stretch of wall comprised of little stones inlaid into cement that confused me, until I had passed by it enough to realise that it was a design choice, as I could see now the front of the building, which opened up onto a road to my right and a parking lot for what qualified as a large store in this little town, called the Country Grocer. The speed limit through the centre of town was only 15 miles per hour, so I had a nice little drive past the post office on the right, with its big blue boxes out front, and its big white windows where I could see through to the PO boxes with their little brass stars on the wall, and a long counter with a till and a couple of workers milling about, and the large white bank on the left with its marble columns out front and its immaculately trimmed flowering bushes too. Past these, there was a quaint little library on the right with a rounded front that stretched out into a brick building that looked like a recent addition, where the road split up that way, whereas it looked like a residential area, while on the left was a large boarding house style set of apartments. After this was another set of shops, and I pulled in front of one with a large red sign hanging from a metal pole that swayed gently in the breeze, called Red's Hardware, and I parked the truck. We fished around in the centre council for some change and got out of the cab onto the little street and approached the meter. It was much older than anything I had been accustomed to, with 3 little slots, one for nickels, one for dimes, and one for quarters. I rolled a quarter through the slot, and the meter at the top swung, like the hand of a clock, to show that it had been activated. Very quaint. Erring on the side of caution, I rolled a couple of dimes and nickels in, as well, until the meter was completely filled, the little hand refusing to move any further to the right, and then made my way across the sidewalk towards the door. There were 3 small stone steps leading up to the door, which was wooden and painted over with some kind of lacquer, and a smooth brass handle. I pushed the door open gently and was greeted with the sound of a little bell that tinkered notification of my arrival. The air inside the hardware store smelled amazing. A mixture of sawdust and metal and wood polish. I breathed deep for a moment, looking around to take in the sight of the wooden counter with its old register and liftgate to walk behind. The various shelves throughout the small store space held various items, like gloves and trowels, headlamps and multi-tool kits. The wall to my right was covered with hooks that held hammers, screwdrivers, pliers, and other tools that seemed to stretch the entire length of the shop towards the back. This sure beat an hour-long adventure inside of Home Depot trying to find anything that I would need. A moment later, I was greeted by an older gentleman. I must have been in his late 60s, the youngest, wearing a canvas apron over his button-up shirt and khaki pants. He greeted me and introduced himself as Red, the man from the sign. I shook his hand and offered my name, Eli. I figured that I must be the new keeper at the Stalward, as word had gotten around town that a new family had moved in. Word sure does travel fast in a small town. That would be me. Yes, sir, I replied. Just moved in with my family. He, at once, with a huge friendly smile, welcomed me and mine to the town, and told me about the festival in town coming up, letting me know that it would be great for the kids. I laughed jovially and assured him that we had been told about the festival by a fellow named Devlin and would be sure to attend when the time came. Red nodded once when I replied, then got right to business with asking what I had come in looking for, before showing me around the store, pulling items off shelves and off the walls, and bringing them up to the counter every few items or so, to lay them down near the till when his arms got full. I had tried to help carry some of the things, but he assured me that he was old-fashioned that way, and had been doing this for many years, and that it wasn't a problem, but a delight to serve me. He did, however, allow me to help him carry out a couple of large bags from the soil and seed in the back room with him, so that he wouldn't have to make several trips. By the time it was all said and done, the wooden counter, where his old-fashioned register, was piled high with items as he made his way through the lift gate to start ringing everything up. I couldn't help but smile at the quaintness of the whole experience, or at the sound of the register as he pressed down the large brass keys and the little markers popped up in the window to show you the total. And then I had a small moment of panic, and I realised I might need cash for payment. Fortunately, he asked cash or card, and when I said card, he slid me a grey little box that was connected by a wire to something under the counter that I couldn't see, which had an old slide-style card reader on the side and a number pad with a little digital stream. No chip reader, but at least I wasn't going to have to find an ATM and deal with the embarrassment of having to put the transaction on hold while I tracked one down. It took a few tries to get the reader to work on my card, something Red assured me happened all the time, and to complete the purchase. Red bagged everything up and then helped me carry it all outside and put it into the bed of my truck. We thanked him and then asked if he knew of any place in town that might sell bedding. He chuckled about the idea of my little lady sending me out for sheets, then pointed me towards Fuller's 5 and Dime, complete with directions, even though it was just down the road the way that I had come. I got in the truck and turned on the engine. We're pulling out from the curb into the street, back the way that I had initially come, surprised by the sheer lack of traffic. Only one car had gone by while I was loading up the truck bed with Red, and the only other cars that I had seen were a couple parked out in front of the country grocer as I made my way back through the sleepy little town. Once again, I parked on the side of the street and rolled more coins than necessary into the little grey meter and headed inside. Like Red's, there were 3 little stars that led up to the door. All the buildings on this part of town must have been built at the same time, and then adapted into the shops as they stood, now as times changed and years went by. Another little bell tinkled through the shop as I opened the door and stepped inside, greeted with the smell of fresh linen and laundry soap. This shop was laid out very similarly to the hardware store, with a long wooden counter and a lift gate to the left, various stands of shelves in the centre. The right wall, though, rather than being hung with hooks, was comprised of hundreds of little cubbyhole-style shelves, each filled with sheets, towels, pillowcases, pillows, various bits of linen, and patterned fabrics and the like. Behind the counter stood a plump woman with short cropped grey hair, who introduced herself as Molly and began the small town spiel that I had come to expect. He figured that I must be the new keeper at the Stalward, welcomed me to town, gushed about the local festival, asked about the children. Small towns, I tell you, everyone is so friendly. I smiled and nodded along politely, and responded when necessary, but for whatever reason, I was honestly too hungry to really pay too much attention to her. We had had a decently large breakfast this morning. It was unusual that I'd be hungry by now, but I chalked it up to the fresh air on the drive into town, and followed Molly around the store as she helped me pick out a whole new bedroom linen set for my wife. She actually beamed at the thought that I was trying to surprise my beloved, and flittered about the store, pulling items from shelves that matched the colour theme once we had settled on a couple of shades of purple and violet that Molly assured me had preposterous names that I cannot remember now. Do I believe lilac might have been one of them? Sheets, pillowcases, throw pillows, several blankets for the cold nights to come, a satiny duvet cover, something called a dust skirt, and several $100 later, and the linen was packed up into a couple of plain brown boxes and tied off with some ribbon that Molly had under the counter in an effort to make them look more like wrapped gifts. I thanked her profusely for all of her help and effort, and assured her that I would be certain to give Ashley her card, since Molly apparently was the president of the Auxiliary Rotary Club, which was for the women of the town. I wasn't sure if it was something that Ashley was going to be interested in, but it might be good for her. After the years that we had spent living in the city, where she didn't leave the house much, she might really enjoy something like this. I knew that she came from a small town herself, and had often talked about participating in some of the local activities there, though I never really understood the details. I wasn't raised in a small town, and most of it, honestly, just made no sense to me. But I figured, at the very least, she might have a chance to meet some of the local women, even if they were older than she was. Maybe attend a lunch or something now and then. As I exited the shop, arms piled high with boxes, I was struck to see that the sun was already beginning to sink into the sky of the late afternoon. I tucked the boxes quickly into the cab of the truck and pulled out my phone to ring Ashley. Had I really been gone all day already? I must have spent more time in the hardware store with Red than I thought, not to mention with chatty Molly at the 5 and dime store. 5:45 p.m, my phone read. I was flabbergasted and tried to call out to Ashley, but was greeted with 0 bars of service. With a heavy sigh, I started up the truck and began the drive back towards home, hoping that Ashley wouldn't be too upset at me for losing track of the time today. I once more passed by St. Thomas Church as I followed the road out of town, this time noting that there appeared to be a small school attached to the back of it, with the typical metal-trimmed windows and glass-panelled front door. Several drawings and paintings, presumably done by the children, had been hung in the windows, shining through with various shades of blue and green paint in the forms of flowers and fish. I turned on the radio in the truck and was greeted with static blasting out of my speakers so loud that I jumped. It always did this when it wasn't picking up a Bluetooth signal from my phone. I did not remember having the volume dial up so loud. Frustrated at my carelessness, I pressed the seek button on the radio several times until it picked up a local music station that was playing some sort of instrumental music, rather like the oldies meets bluegrass meets jazz, and began my journey back up the winding hill towards the lighthouse. The road started to become darker, with the sun sinking behind the trees. I turned on my headlight and laid my foot down on the gas, a little heavier than I normally would, realising that it had now become a race to get home in time to turn on the light for the Stalward before sunset. I hoped that I would make it well before then, but with each passing minute, it seemed, as my tires spun and thrummed along the pavement, the sun was sinking further and further down into the landscape. The trees that stood like sentinels on either side of the road gained, with each breath I took, a deeper and darker mantle of the enveloping darkness as twilight approached. The depths which stretched between the trunks of trees becoming more and more obscure as the solid yellow lines of the road disappeared, mile by mile, under the hood of my truck. Up and up I went, along the sloping road towards the Stalward, where it stood, in darkness itself, its lights not sweeping out over the landscape in its steady rhythm, because I wasn't there to pull the switch. Frantic, as I made my way around the endless curves and turns of the winding road, climbing higher and higher towards the cliff, facing the sun as it continued to sink and fill the world with darkness. I began running my left hand through my hair in agitation as I drove and started to berate myself. How could I have lost an entire day in town like that? I had only been to 2 different stores. What was wrong with me? I had left Ashley and the kids alone all day in the lighthouse and hadn't even bothered to lock the gate. Night was coming swiftly, and sundown was approaching all the more rapidly as I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, the engine of my truck roaring loudly through the quiet stillness of twilight as it settled down between the branches on the trees, retiring the day and opening the woods up to the darkness of the night, and all the woodland creatures with their glowing eyes that must dwell deep within, the kinds of things that Devlin liked to hunt. Wildcats and wolves and owls that roamed freely through the silence and the dark. I could hear the sound of my engine bouncing off the trees that surrounded the road, echoing back and intensifying, louder and louder through the growing darkness, blocked neither by the windows of my truck nor the soft instrumental music playing through the speakers, rattling my teeth and contributing to the intensity of my flight back up the hill towards the cliff that would dive sheer off into the frigid sea. The road appeared more as a tunnel, flanked by darkness that was pressing in from all sides. The only escape to either continue forward through the dim light of my headlights, their twin beams, seeming to become shorter and shorter as I sped along the road, my eyes glued to the double yellow lines that stretched up the river of smooth, black pavement in my quest to search for home and reach there before the sun and its light disappeared from the sky. And there, at last, just ahead, a break in the trees that could only mean one thing. I was near to the grounds of the Stalward and would be home any moment. I slowed the truck as I neared, not wanting to have to brake hard and alert Ashley and the kids to my speeding, as of course I would likely get lectured about being safe, and I laughed at myself over how unnecessarily panicked I had been on my drive home. I would, of course, make it with plenty of time. There was still some sunlight ahead, peeking out from around the trees in the distance, where the forest had been cut away to clear space for the lighthouse and its grounds. I would have plenty of time to get inside, head up the stairs, and go through the whole procedure to get the light lit, well before the sun sank down into the sea on the horizon. The densely packed forest just had a way of blocking the sunlight and a good view of the sky as I had made my way through, leading me to think that it must have been much later in the day than it was. The old forests tend to do. I took a few deep breaths and ran my hand through my hair once more, making a nice, clean 25 miles per hour, and resolved not to tell Ashley about my little lapse in judgment. He would, no doubt, decide that it must be a side effect of my concussion, and that I would be need to be seeing a doctor about it. I would just try to explain to her that I had lost track of time and time, apologise for being late, and perhaps offer to do the dishes after dinner. The grinds could wait for tomorrow, after all. The boxes in the back seat would be sure to earn me some brownie points, I thought. After all, we had spent so much time and time doing something nice for her. I hadn't meant for it to take so long, but surely the result would be seeing her happy smile. A special smile that she lucky saved just for me. The one where she'd look down at the ground, lips pursed as she tried to fight the smile welling up in her cheeks, and then look up at me over the tops of her glasses. That made my heart melt. And I reminded myself there would be baked goods of glorious deliciousness for dessert tonight. My stomach growled at the thought of dessert, and I wondered what Ashley would be making for dinner. I hadn't stuff to eat at all while I was in town, and I felt like I could eat a horse to myself. Probably some combination of the fresh air and the rush of adrenaline that we had had earlier. All in all, though, the panic from my drive up the mountain towards the Stalward had subsided, replaced with daydreams about dinner and spending the evening with my family. When I cleared the trees to the clearing where the Stalward stood on its uneven crowns. And then I slammed on the brakes of the truck, coming to a screeching halt right there in the middle of the road, staring blankly out towards the sea, my eyes blinking rapidly in disbelief, my mind struggling to comprehend what lay before me. I shook my head several times. I closed my eyes and held my breath before looking again. I slapped myself lightly on the left cheek and then the right, but nothing seemed to help. I had expected the need to get out of the truck, to open the gate that I had left unlocked in order to pull up to the driveway. And numbly, I got out of the cab of the truck, putting it in park, right there in the middle of the road. I got out, stumbling forwards, as if it were exactly what I was headed to do. Only, there was no gate, no driveway, no lighthouse. The only thing standing between myself and the sheer rock face of the cliff that plummeted into the swirling sea beyond was several acres of open field, wilted in places and barren in others, run through with molehills and damp earth.